Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to be here today to be able to bring today's lesson to you. It will be in session 10, and that's page 91 in your quarterly, and it's called Humility Required. Now, as believers, we must be careful to honor God in all things. So we shouldn't let our pride come into play any at all. Today's lesson is going to be in Daniel chapter 4, verses 28 through 37. And we're going to be talking a little bit, still talking about King Nebuchadnezzar. And we're going to see how his pride led him into a lot of trouble. So, and you know, pride is such an ugly word when we think about it. I mean, it really has no place in anyone's life. I know sometimes we may characterize ourselves as self-confident to avoid thinking of ourselves as prideful. Well, self-confidence sometimes can lead to prideful situations. And many of us live life as though we are the ones in control of everything that happens. And that's not true. We're not in control. The only person who's in control is God. But eventually, something along the way will happen in life that causes us to wonder if we are really in charge. And it is in those moments that we discover who God is and what our role is in His creation, if we look. And before we get started today, I just want to ask you a question and let you keep thinking about it as we go on through the lesson. What images come to mind when you hear the word pride? And what makes being called prideful hard to swallow? Now we're going to go to understanding the context, and that's going to be chapter 4, verses 1 through 5, and then verses 31. You know, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and Daniel interpreted the first dream. Well, lo and behold, he had another dream. And he again summoned all his wise men to tell him about it. And as with the first dream, they failed. So the king had to ask Daniel to explain his dream. Well, Daniel told the king that his dream was about a tree. And the tree was tall, and it flourished. And all the creatures of the field and everything ate from it. And then a holy one came from heaven to have the tree cut down, leaving a stump. Daniel explained to the king that the stump was him, and that he would lose his mind and live as an animal for 7 years. He would not be restored until he acknowledged the Lord as the Most High. Well, after the end of a year, the dream came to realization. And after 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar came to his senses and acknowledged that God, the Most High Ruler, is over the human kingdom. Now let's get back to 539 BC. And that's 23 years after the death of the king. Belshazzar ruled Babylon. He held a great feast for his nobles. And during the banquet, he ordered that the gold goblets that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem be brought out so they could drink wine and stuff out of them. Well, while they were drinking wine, a mysterious hand appeared and wrote a strange message on the wall. Well, he became extremely frightened, and he summoned his wise men. However, they could not interpret the dream, just like the wise men that Nebuchadnezzar had. They couldn't do it either. So the queen reminded the king of Daniel. So he summoned Daniel and said, "Can you reveal this image to me, this message?" So Daniel reminded the king of Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance. He retold how Nebuchadnezzar's experience. He told him of his experience. And Daniel informed the king that the message was a gloomy warning. As king, he had been weighed like a coin on a scale and was found deficient. As a result, his kingdom was to be taken from him. And you know what happened? It happened that very night. Now you can look at that in chapter 5, verses 13 through 31 at your convenience. And just look at the contrast between his father and the son. They both apparently were arrogant, even though the father repented at last, but the son took off being arrogant. And he failed when he took the golden goblets that they had brought from Jerusalem and started drinking them out of them and defiling them. Let's go into the text now, and that's going to be starting out in verses 28 through 30 on chapter 4. And we're going to see where the king has declared his pride. So I'm going to read them to you, so you can follow along with me if you like, or if you have your Bible, you may also use that. All this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar at the end of 12 months, as he was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. The king exclaimed, "Is this not my Babylon the Great that I have built to be a royal residence by my vast power and for my majestic glory?" Well, we can see that those two verses was just the wrong thing to be saying. So we can see that the king, he was a great king, but he was an extremely arrogant person. Even after seeing God's power revealed with the furnace, after he threw Daniel's 3 friends into the furnace and that they came out unscorched, even after he'd written us that, he did not change. So the judgment God was about to declare occurred after the end of 12 months. Now, following the king's dream and Daniel's interpretation was when this was going to happen. 12 months after that, God had given the king time to repent, but he would not allow pride in the king's heart to continue. God wasn't going to let that go on. So this happened as Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof at the royal palace in Babylon. It was a magnificent palace, adorned and surrounded by canals and gardens and walkways and much, much more. See, the palace roof provided the king a great place and a great vantage point to see the expansive territory of his realm. So it was a beautiful place, and it was high above everything else, so the king could look out and see his kingdom almost. And this attributed to Babylon's greatness was the way the buildings and everything were done. And he thought it was to his own power that all this was done. The king suggested that the purpose for Babylon's greatness was for his own majestic glory. Well, both the Old and New Testament remind us that our boasting should be in God and not in ourselves. When we start boasting in ourselves, it's a one-way street for us. But everything that all our boasting should be about God and God alone. So, another question for you. How can a person avoid the trappings of his or her own success? Does a person have to be successful to fall into the trappings of pride? I don't think you have to be successful. I think you can fall into being pride at any moment. The least little thing can make you be prideful. So let's go on now to we're going to see that reality is defined. And that's in verses 31 through 33. And I'm going to read 31 and 32 first, and then we'll go back and read 33. While the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared that the kingdom has departed from you. You will be driven away from people to live with the wild animals. You will feed on grass like cattle for 7 periods of time until you acknowledge that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms, and he gives them to anyone he wants. So God pretty much told Nebuchadnezzar what was going to happen to him. See, Nebuchadnezzar had failed to recognize God as his sovereign ruler. He gloated over Babylon. And it's recorded in verse 30 that while the words were still in the king's mouth, God declared the kingdom would depart from him. Well, the king began to act kind of illogically, and he became as an animal. For the next 7 years, he would feed on the grass like a cattle. This is something for a man who attempted to make the Jewish exiles eat from his table. He was now compelled to eat in the field. And here was a man who forced exiles to conform to his way of life. And he was driven out of his land and made to adapt to the ways of the animal kingdom. You see, the king thought himself superior to all mankind. But he became less than human. He was pushed away from his own kingdom, not by man, but by God. God told the king there was a way of redemption for him, and it was not until Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged God as the ruler over all nations that he would experience peace. You see, the king had previously recognized that God was over other gods. However, he had missed the point of the furnace, the fiery furnace. God is in control of his creation, including the rise and fall of human kingdoms. See, the king had not even realized that. You would have thought he would have realized it after the first dream he had and everything, and then of course then again after the fiery furnace where he put Daniel's 3 friends into it, he should have realized there isn't but one God, but he didn't. He tried to put himself up there with God. Let's look at verse 33 now. At the moment the message against Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled, he was driven away from the people. He ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with dew from the sky, until his hair grew like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird claws. Boy, that had to be a sight. That would almost scare you to death if you walked upon somebody like that today. But let's see what the quarterly says here about verse 33. And again it says, and it stresses, at that moment, God's judgment was immediately. The message against the king was fulfilled in every detail. He was driven away from people and no longer lived in the palace. He became a virtual member of the animal kingdom. The king ate grass like cattle. So whatever the nature of the king's affliction was, it came directly from God. It didn't just come on like a sickness. It came from God. So his body was drenched with dew from the sky, from where he slept out and under the sky during the night and day. He slept on the ground. He had no fancy palace to sleep in, no fancy bed. He had to sleep on the ground like the cattle did. And he no longer got to enjoy the luxuries of the palace. His hair grew like eagle's feathers. Now, I think the book tells us that this describes like the matting of his hair. It kind of matted up, and that it resembled feathers because it wasn't washed and it wasn't combed. It was just matted, and his nails grew like those of a bird. Man, can you imagine how long they would be, and they'd start curving it under your hand? That had to be a gross looking sight for a king. The king didn't have any idea what was happening to him. And the experience must have been terrifying. God had taken him from the splendor of the Babylon palace to a humble place among the animals. See, God had earlier exalted Nebuchadnezzar, and now God had humbled him. Perhaps there is a correlation here between this story and Genesis 3. Now, let's follow with me here. In their arrogance, Adam and Eve disregarded the Lord's command not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They listened to the devil instead, who told them they would be like God. They acted as though they were God. They behaved disobediently and arrogantly toward the Lord, eating from the tree. So God cast him out of the Garden of Eden. Nebuchadnezzar thought of himself as a god. He told Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego there was no God that could rescue them from his power. So he cast men out of society into a burning furnace for their rebellion against him. So God tossed him from society for his insurgents against him. So it came around full circle for the king. So how does what happened to Nebuchadnezzar remind us of our plight apart from God and his grace? Just ask yourself that question a few times. Now let's see if the king finally gave honor to God. So we're going to read verses 34 and 35, and then we'll finish up on 36 and 37, I think. 36. But at the end of those days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity returned to me. Then I praised the Most High, and honored and glorified him who lives forever. For his domain is an everlasting domain, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does what he wants with the army of heaven and the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can block his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" So we can see at the end of the 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar looked up to heaven, and his sanity was returned to him at that instant. His restoration came because he acknowledged God's glory and gave God the honor and praise. The king now recognized his place. By looking up to heaven, it likely indicated his recognition of God's sovereignty. As his first course of action upon restoration, the king praised the Most High. He now honored and glorified him who lives forever. See, God humbled the king, and the king thought himself as worthy of such glory and honor. Now he recognized that glory belonged only to the Lord. The Lord would rule the universe long after the king. Now the king did offer two statements to reaffirm this fact. First, he said of the Lord, his domain is an everlasting domain. See, the king's domain was temporary. God's was everlasting. Second, the king had affirmed that God's kingdom is from generation to generation. Now, a long-reigning king might live to rule over 2 generations, or possibly 3. But God Almighty ruled every generation. No one could compare with the vastness of God's power. And no one can compare with the length of his reign. The king recognized his smallness in comparison to God's greatness. The king affirmed that God does what he wants. There was a time when the king did as he pleased, but God's power extended to both the army of heaven and the inhabitants of earth. That is, God ruled the universe, not merely a kingdom on planet Earth. So when Nebuchadnezzar declared to God, "There is no one who can block his hand," he spoke from personal experience. He thought he had limitless power, but God humbled him. No one dared challenge the Lord by asking him, "What have you done?" God could do as he pleased. Babylon's king had learned this lesson the hard way. Now let's look at 36 through 37. At that time my sanity returned to me, and my majesty and splendor returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and my nobles sought me out. I was reestablished over my kingdom, and even more greatness came to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of the heavens, because all his works are true and his ways are just. He is able to humble those who walk in pride. Quite a change for Nebuchadnezzar, wouldn't you say? You know, we do not know exactly how Nebuchadnezzar regained his throne. Perhaps his son had ruled in his place during those 7 years. We don't know. But it says, my advisors and my nobles sought me out. Well, this could indicate that they recognized he was ready to rule again and his senses had come back. So, he further affirmed, I was reestablished over my kingdom. When he took the throne, he testified even more greatness to me. This new phrase of Nebuchadnezzar's reign would feature a new perspective. He recognized God's role in making him who he was, confessing God as the King of the heavens, the one true God, who is able to humble those who walk in pride. So the third encounter that Nebuchadnezzar had with Israel's God, in chapter 2, he bowed before the God of Daniel when Daniel interpreted the king's dream. In chapter 3, the king praised the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when God rescued the 3 men from the fiery furnace. Then we see in chapter 4, God further humbled the king and taught him the meaning of humility. God provided a powerful witness to his greatness, and Nebuchadnezzar gained a new perspective of all that God had given him. So we can see all those encounters kind of finally moved the king where God wanted him. It showed him that God is the ruler over all. And we need to remember that lesson. Don't let our pride and arrogance try to take over God's place in our hearts. You know, how does honoring and praising God help keep us in a proper perspective in life? Think about it. You know, people must be aware of their potential prideful declarations. God is in control of his creation, including the rise and fall of nations. And God is worthy of our honor and praise. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson today on humility and how God had taught King Nebuchadnezzar the true meaning of humility. He put Nebuchadnezzar through all these things before he even come close to realizing. But in the end, he realized who the true ruler was. God bless y'all. Have a great day.